This week's lecture turns to postmodernism, which is not technically a theory, but instead a critical strategy for looking at culture and the world around us. However, before understanding postmodernism, we must first define modernism that preceded it and defined the 20th century and understanding the culture of it. Now we have multiple definitions, but at the time we can see that modernism or modernists can really be located in the mid-19th century to roughly 1970. So this is going to be roughly from when the Industrial Revolution became fully felt throughout Europe and America. We have railway stations and roads connecting everything and cities of over 1 million people. This is going to last and cause a rejection of previously held beliefs and institutions that becomes modernism. And this is true in all the various media and different types of cultural production, film, music, art, architecture, etc. Now, this rejection will last until the post-industrial age that we will discuss here shortly. Now, the term postmodernism derives largely from the 1980s and publications we'll talk about today. So modernism, as it develops in the different arts, is supposed to capture the ever-present and ever-changing notion of what the world was like after the Industrial Revolution, how quickly scientific innovation changed our world, how we move about, how we interact with one another, everything changed. And so we reject past traditions and invent styles that can express the world at this new breakneck speed, the new modern world. So the avant-garde in all of cultural production became self-consciously cutting edge. Now, modernism can be defined as the earthquake, as it were, that brought down the pre-20th century practices in culture and rejected the fundamental elements of practice in all the various media. So say structure and melody and music were rejected, perspective and a unified composition was rejected in art, and in literature we start to reject unified narrative structure. So what modernists sought to do were seek out new ways of attacking these established institutions that have existed for centuries, these cultural institutions, art institutions, by of course mocking them, as we see here, presenting a urinal, for instance, as a sculpture. So the history of Western culture, we must also remember as it develops in modernism, is also going to be a unitary and a totalitizing narrative, where we emphasize a heroic, generally male author or artist, and it's centered in a very kind of Eurocentric fashion around Western Europe and America. So this becomes the history of listing off the most famous modern authors, playwrights, musicians, artists, filmmakers, and they tend to be very, number one, white, and two, male, and three, perpetuating this romantic myth of conquering these previous traditions and heroizing these individuals. So how do we add the post to modernism? Well, as seen here, you can understand modernism in the arts as starting off trying to understand the world, seeing it through a window and seeing the realities beyond it. That can be in any of the various cultural productions we'll discuss, especially with regards to the simulacrum here shortly. Now, once we move into the early 20th century, especially high modernism, as was noted in Barry's reading, around the 1930s and 40s, we start bashing our head into a wall, trying to force people to look only at the text, only at the film, only at the painting, that there is no reality beyond it. Now this of course runs its course, and then we have the chicken looking in a mirror here, where we see that we are going to become more self-consciously self-conscious. That in fact in the 1970s and 80s, when we find postmodernism beginning to flourish in the arts and in literature, we find that we begin rejecting these rigid truths and hierarchies of modernism, and we instead were interested in past traditions that modernism itself had rejected. Instead, we begin valuing pastiche, or bringing varied elements together in these new mixtures and bringing new motifs together that previously would have been fragmentary and inappropriate. And we also return to figurative imagery in all these various media. As mentioned at the outset, postmodernism coincides with the post-industrial revolution in society in the 1970s. This will find that the majority of workers shift from producing goods to that of a provision of services. So most people actually provide service instead of manufacturing at this time. So these are going to find that ideas are actually going to be more significant and powerful and are now the global currency. This is the information age, and so we begin valuing ideas in cultural production over craft, for instance. Now, Hal Foster, a famous postmodern author, stated that it's not just a style in any form, whether that be music, film, art, or otherwise, but postmodernism is a condition of life in this new media-saturated global village, that our context of class and culture formations are constantly shifting, and so therefore in post-industrial societies, it's difficult to know exactly where you are, how you fit within this vast range of information and people that are more connected than ever. And how do we know exactly what is real? So along with that, it's not surprising we begin challenging these master narratives. And we find that Lyotard in The Postmodern Condition from 1979 is going to state that Western masters and these Western master narratives, say the grand production of the rise of Michelangelo in the Renaissance, or Shakespeare, or once again Picasso in the 20th century, these no longer work for us because they don't help us understand the constant flux of culture that we all deal with on a daily basis. There is no one narrative any longer. We have multiple narratives that are taking place simultaneously, even in your own lives right now. Therefore, we also abandon these divine pretensions of authorship that are implicit in the omniscient narratorial stance, especially for literature. So no longer do we have one omniscient narrator, for instance, in film and or literature, but instead we have several versions, many different strands of narratives happening simultaneously. So no longer is just the white male heterosexual author and or person who's delivering content and information the authority figure. Because we have abandoned the unified narrative and the sole author having all of the omniscient power, there is no single explanation for culture possible now. Because it can't be reduced to economic determinism, with Marxism we will get to, or psychic determinism, such as in psychoanalysis that we covered. So it's too complex now in our own lives. So we are going to examine instead culture as a process, not as something that is stable and fixed, because our social contexts shape that process and shift constantly as we are bombarded on a daily basis with all of these various information streams and devices. So now we're going to be rejecting the idea that the European tradition sets universal standards for judging, that we can't look at other cultures and say they're not doing what we do, therefore they're inferior. So this decenters the West since postmodernism. We have to look at a culture for its own values, its own language, its own traditions. So no longer is the West the center of the world. So all of these approaches that we'll be discussing in this entire class are generally going to be used as a critical strategy, just as pastiche, where you're going to be in a hodgepodge fashion, bringing different things together when appropriate. So too, in postmodernist critical strategy, we might look at and ask questions about how women have been overlooked in certain treatments in the 20th century, and how women of, say, Asian descent, bringing in not only a feminist, but also a post-colonialist agenda, and then ask about the socioeconomic impact that had on this particular population. So we can be very specific and ask multiple theoretical lines of inquiry simultaneously now. We need not just choose one track. So here in Fragmentation, Pastiche, and the Simulacrum, we need to help define some of these terms that come up with postmodernism quite often. So one of them is going to be pastiche, as we already mentioned. That's where you're going to put together different elements, genres, and or imagery that belong to different subjects, different derivations, different genres. So we mash up, if you will, these various elements to present something new. We find that also pluralism is one of the most important things for understanding postmodernism because it denies that there is one unified approach to cultural production. Instead, pluralism, as plural is going to indicate, is going to promote diversity in production and reception of works, that there's no one correct perspective, there's no one person who is going to be imparting meaning into a film, a work, a building, anything anymore. Therefore, there are multiple interpretations as well. So there is no one correct interpretation of your favorite film, for instance. We find that this approach also is going to challenge this idea of the masculine authority figure who is original in what he produces. So therefore, we're instead going to focus on recycling old images or commodities, or putting this blurred line between, say, high and low art or culture, right? So we find that we take things from low culture and present it in high culture now. So as an example from my field, Sherry Levine is a photographer that rephotographs other people's photographs. So once again, there's nothing original about what she does. And there are lots of films now that, of course, are self-consciously bringing up things that are going to be ironically seen from the past. And you find that postmodernism loves irony. So if we're going to understand the difference, where the modernism is going to make us feel as though we are alienated from the world surrounding us, that we have these thousands of people that were surrounding us in cities, yet we can still feel ironically completely alone. And so that's what modernism attempts to deal with. Postmodernism deals with the further fragmentation that happens by way of these new ways of living in the world in late capitalism. So we find that we are alienated, but now fragmented as well. Now, the author that you'll read for this week, Jean Baudrillard, is going to write in his Simulacra and Simulations of 1981 that the notion of even communicating meaning is going to be complicated because of technology and the media and this notion of stardom. So he gives examples such as the mass media that is out there is not actually going to be signifying anything. It's not attached to a signifier. There is no reality that we're really talking about and looking at. There is no thing that the signifier reproduces or represents. So he gives the idea of celebrities, for instance. So the simulacrum, according to him, is the image that then becomes reality, but it's a false image because it's not representing something that actually exists in reality. So you have celebrities, as he brings up, like Madonna, who are all image and no substance. For we often hear postmodernist critics stating, who's actually there? What are we actually representing? And you can say this about virtually any celebrity, that being that is not who they are. We have projected and commodified stardom to where we don't want to understand a real person that is being presented. Instead, this is a character. According to Baudrillard, there are 4 stages of emptiness that we have arrived at now in the postmodern era from the modernist. So it begins with the sign actually representing basic reality. Whatever we're writing, filming, saying, or trying to communicate, it matches up with something in reality. So I say dog, and there's a corresponding furry quadruped that exists right in the canine family that actually is in the world. The second level is where the sign begins to misrepresent or distort reality behind it, but it still is there. So this is early cult of the celebrity, the commodification of stardom, and of course questioning whether or not Norma Jean Baker was in fact Marilyn Monroe, right? So we're going to not be showing her as is. We change her name, we change her appearance. It's the stardom that we care about, not the person, but she still exists. She's still a person, for instance, earlier on when she is reaching her height of popularity in the late 1950s. The third stage is going to be that the sign begins to disguise the fact that there's no corresponding reality underneath it. So you find that this is going to be where we're going to be showing something that has no basis in reality. And then fourth, we find the sign then finally bears no relation to reality at all. So what do we mean by this, and what are some examples? So the examples that are given largely are going to be that of the media. So now we're threatening the foundation of Western thought and Plato, who stated that there's something concrete. Even if we're talking about the realm of forms, it represents something concrete here on Earth. So at this stage, there's no way of getting away from this due to mass media, because now the image, like reality TV, is more real than reality. And reality TV is something that's written on a lot when it comes to postmodernist criticism, because it's a great example of something that appears incredibly real but is entirely fake. Right? So we are in the realm now of what is called hyperreality. We have moved beyond above reality, right? Hyper in this way. And so we find that reality no longer is reflected, even though that's all we really interact with and watch. The example Baudrillard gives is actually Disneyland, and this may help us understand what we mean by hyperreality and or the simulacrum. So we find that in Disneyland, there is a reality of things that you can interact with, princess castles, characters, rides, but they do not correspond to anything in the actual real world. So there is no Cinderella's princess castle that exists, and this is merely a replication of it. There are no cartoon ducks and or mice and or other characters. These are representing things that do not exist. And so that is where you get this sign that has no corresponding reality or basis in reality. Now, this is going to find that postmodernism and then culture decenters Europe, as we mentioned. And so we find that these male authors are also no longer seen as the center. So we begin replacing the single master narrative with multiple histories now of film, media, art. If you're, of course, going to look up in any of your various fields, you'll notice that they keep rewriting the history to include those that were marginalized or overlooked, especially peoples of various ethnicities, and then women are the ones that are most often overlooked. So the emphasis now is going to be placed on, as we move forward, multinational perspectives, race, class, gender, sexuality. These are going to be what is interesting. So you find that in a cartoon, just to show you, you have this notion earlier on that genius is possible, that I am a genius. But then later on, we now question, no, the category of genius is a construct of in and of itself. Therefore, our notion of genius is at fault, not production any longer. As your reading for today is going to sum up, well, that is the Berry reading, is that the difference between modernists and postmodernists is somewhat difficult to ascertain in certain fields like literature. So to clarify, he would state that modernists are going to lament fragmentation. They admit that it exists, but they lament it. They want something from the past, while postmodernists celebrate it. As Berry is going to state most succinctly, postmodern critics are going to enjoy mystical insight. That is, what was taken as normally seen as solid in the real world is actually just a tissue of dreamlike images. So postmodern critics, even though they do not come up with answers or solutions, are going to enjoy the play of words and watching things unravel, just like deconstruction did, just like Derrida had. And so this is a wonderful game of irony that they're playing. So what exactly do postmodernist critics do as we sum up here? Well, number one, they discover postmodernist themes in works, so we search them out. So you find this is very common in film or cinema, in which they're looking at the themes that might come up, like pastiche, pluralism, etc., the fragmentation, for instance. Secondly, they're going to foreground the fiction that exists in our world and what they call the disappearance of the real, just as Baudrillard is going to mention that we now live in a hyper-reality of simulacra, that there is nothing really significant, tangible, and real, which of course helps explain the popularity of certain social media platforms that allow you to directly ground someone's experience in reality, because we have lost that. Third, we find that we're going to be foregrounding intertextual elements, right? So you're going to be looking at, and if you're producing something that's postmodernist, you want to make sure it is very obvious it is a parody on something, that it's bringing multiple things together, that there are allusions to other things in it. It cannot be self-sufficient and self-reflective, right? It must be inclusive and in a playful way look at what came before it. And finally, they love foregrounding irony, that there is, of course, a notion of ironic unintended consequences in cultural production that we have today. And admitting that helps us admit some of the hypocritical ways in which we have approached, right, patriarchal culture in the past, and trying to rectify that with a conversation.